Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and I welcome here to our conversation, to our roundtable discussion on bringing language to the admissions discussion. My name is Amanda Seewald, and I am the owner and author of Maracas Language Programs and the owner of Learning Kaleidoscope Educational Consulting. I also serve as the president-elect for the Joint National Committee on Language and the National Council for Language and International Studies. And I'm thrilled to be here today with my two colleagues, Dr. Danko Sipka, professor and head of the linguistics faculty at Arizona State University, and Dr. William Nichols, Bill Nichols, at the Department Chair for World Languages and Cultures at Georgia State University. Thank you both for joining me today. I wanted to start by just explaining where this idea for this conversation came from. It's something that's overdue, but it's also something that kind of came from an organic situation for me. And I want to first thank Linda Ignatz for asking me to do this, because it really speaks to something that kind of happened in my life. Became clear to me about 2 years ago when I was embarking on the exciting time of looking for a college with my daughter, that there was a real disconnect between the work being done in language education to grow proficiency and recognition of proficiency, like through the SEAL, and the college admissions process. And so I had this unique perspective, visiting different colleges and hearing them talk about what their universities offer. But again and again, there was this unusual and kind of upsetting theme for someone like me coming to these things, to hear that it was always about, can I test out of a language? And I kept listening for, language as an asset. But as we took steps in this process, my family and I realized that some of these things stood out. One is that universities and colleges are not using language proficiency as an asset in any of their messaging, whether it's in person or by mail or online. That in fact, the tone is almost always about that testing out kind of concept, or avoiding taking language, getting out of the requirements, so to speak. And the lead up to this this important moment as well, I think is also missing something. We're going to talk some more about that with regard to high schools and students who, high schools not having a focus on this within their guidance offices, but also, and more importantly, that might be due to what's going on at the college level. So there's a disconnect again. And even student college data collection software, which I'm sure many of you have seen or have used, does not really collect information on language proficiency. And I think that's one of those disconnects that we can talk about potentially changing. So this all begs the question and kind of the idea of really what happens when students apply to universities and have language proficiency in more than one language. Where in the admissions process does this conversation take place internally in the universities, and how can we impact that? So I want to turn it over to my colleagues to first focus on this idea of where we might find language questions and language understanding in the admissions process. Bill?
Thanks so much, Amanda. That was a great intro to the topic. And I think it's a really timely question. And you really point to something key, which is the disconnect. It's kind of ironic from my point of view. We're in languages departments, we're kind of focused on communication, but there's a serious communication breakdown when it comes to the question of, credit for language proficiency, testing out of a language, the admissions people, advisement, high schools, higher ed. Like, when you talk about silos in education, you often think of disciplinary silos, but here we have these different kind of camps that are key to the students transitioning from high school to college, yet they're not really talking to each other. And often as a department chair, like, I don't really have much interaction with the students until they're entering our department as minors or majors, or maybe even in the lower division classes. So I could talk more, but I want to hear what Danko has to say as well.
Certainly, Danko.
Yeah, so I would first, I basically concurring with everything you've said, both of you, I would like to point to the problem of being readiness at departments of foreign languages to accept those students. So in order to create a proper pipeline and to admit students who have certain language potentials, you have to know where you are, where target levels, proficiency target levels of your classes are, and so on and so forth. But even before that, there has to be an understanding in the community at large that monolingualism is a problem. And that's not always the case, because the predominant, for many years, the things have been changing a little bit, but I would say for many years, this metaphor of a melting pot, which is just a horrible, horrible idea, was predominant, and assimilation and so on and so forth. I spent a semester in Australia 6 years ago, and I saw how general attitude within community can be completely different. Because over there, Tony Abbott was the prime minister at the time, and he said at one occasion, we should all be a part of the Team Australia. He had to apologize for that culturally insensitive utterance, because he was vehemently attacked from all sides. So I think there is a kind of, and that's where JSOC, I think, comes in, JNCA comes in, that basically one should raise awareness about the need for multilingualism. Then we should be ready. We should know what proficiency target outcomes are for our classes. At Arizona State, I've been heading an initiative whereby we aligned all our lower division classes with ACTFL proficiency guidelines, with ACTFL can-do statements, so that students can understand them. So in terms of can-do statements. So now if we have students, we know where we are. We don't know it yet, because we are now calibrating it. So we had series of training for teachers and whatnot. So I think before we look for students, we have to create spaces for them. I think that's also very important, both in the society, so that we don't go with assimilation and so on and so forth, and then within our departments, so that we know where we are.
Well, that's certainly essential. And thank you so much, both of you, for sharing that. You know, when we think about it, where universities are with regard to what they're doing to calibrate their courses and look at the proficiency levels, it's something that from the K through 12 perspective, where I kind of land most of the time, that's what we've been focusing on for so long, is figuring out how we get to the seal of biliteracy. How do we help our instructors and our students understand? How do we help educators and students and families understand how proficiency happens and how it grows? And I think that I agree that I think that it's also, you know, it's very common in education to say, well, we have to do some reflection first, right, before we can grow. And it seems like that's what both of you are saying about the university process. And of course, I would say in general, and of course, from the parental perspective, the entire college admissions process needs to do some reflection as well. As you said, Danko, to look for those spaces, to make space for people who bring assets to the process and to the university system that maybe have not been focused on properly in the past. And so I agree that I think that these things need to happen. I also think it's important, as we approach this, that we look for what these missing pieces are. And that's why when I started the conversation, I wanted to bring up these ideas, so that as anyone who's listening, or anyone who's talking about this or thinking about this, can really start to consider how, what are we able to do? What are we able to achieve if we start from the beginning, which in this case is really kind of that middle school, high school guidance space, and also, but at the same time, simultaneously looking at the university system and working toward each other. I think that's really ultimately how we find the people involved in doing this. And I hope that this can change the way that the conversation goes. As of now, do you see a spot in either of your admissions processes that where you see students being asked about their home language, asked about language proficiency, or anything about the seal?
I don't know of any moment in the admissions process where that is asked of students at my university. As long as I've been chair, and I'm in my 8th year now, I've been talking with different places on campus about where we could have just simply our online placement test kind of inserted into the orientation process, so students are thinking about this as they're coming into campus. So whether or not it's part of the admissions process, at least if we could have it part of the orientation process or in some of their first year kind of gen ed classes where, you know, they're asked, I mean, it's a 20-minute test. It's not complicated, but it's been a kind of uphill battle. The other thing I was going to mention earlier is that, you know, this idea of testing out of a language doesn't necessarily bother me. It's testing out and stopping that bothers me, right? So I've tried to work with admissions and the registrar's office here to gather kind of information for students that come in with AP credit, CLE by literacy, things like that, where we can kind of send them targeted information and say, hey, you're coming in, imagine you're running a marathon, you know, which is your undergraduate education, you're starting at mile 10. You already have these components. You're on your way to a minor, a major, combine that with another degree, and you are setting yourself up for your career, right? So kind of flipping the script on that idea of testing out, because the idea of what they're hearing from their advisors often is progress toward graduation, test out,
Right.
and get through your degree program. And they're not really advising as much on what should you combine together, what's going to set you up for a life after graduation.
And what is the inherent value of continuing in a language, whether it's the language you test in when you get there or another language, but continuing
Absolutely.
towards a level of proficiency that will empower you in any career situation as well and in the world. And I think about that, you know, finishing in four thing at my daughter's university currently, they have a fly in four program, which is wonderful. But, you know, combined with that, and this is something we can talk about a little bit more later, combined with that is kind of this idea of, so then what? Right. So if you're going to test, you know, out of it, or if you're going to test above it, then where are we creating, again, that space, Danko, for students who are looking towards their courses that they need to take for their majors, for their minors, for their double majors and minors, because we know students try to do that. Where are we making space so that the courses for language study can be connected to those majors and minors? Danko. I'm sorry, you're muted.
That's also something that we've been doing at Arizona State. And we have now an initiative together with the Global SEAL. Basically, the idea is to test into the upper division courses. So that's because that solves some problems that typically universities would have, that in many languages, especially less commonly taught languages, and we'll hopefully talk about that later on, about less commonly taught languages, there is always a problem to justify enrollment in upper division courses. So this can be a very great opportunity. And if you know where you are, and most our classes would be either intermediate mid or intermediate high at the end of the 202 sequence, 101 through 202 sequence. So that's basically a springboard for getting into upper division courses.
So, I mean, I really think that this brings us to our next set of questions where we are. We know that right now in this process, there are some missing pieces, right? So how do we change this and where do we start? And I think we've started to discuss this a little bit, right? With regard to where we can do things in the high school space to adjust, even with the software and the questions asked. I know that even on standardized tests, actually, this is amazing. I found this out, that the standardized test questions do include questions about proficiency in language, which I think is great. And if that data is being collected, that's a great place to start by, considering what we have in front of us. I also think that the Seal of Biliteracy, provides us with this incredible opportunity to connect these ideas, to show. I can tell you just kind of an interesting side story. Once I got the Seal of Biliteracy signed into law here in New Jersey a few years ago, one of the very first phone calls that I got as president of my state organization was from a real estate agent, asking me which districts in New Jersey were offering the Seal of Biliteracy, because they wanted to list it on the home listings. And I found that fascinating. And I thought that if we could start to put that type of asset-based focus behind this, that we could really shift the conversation a bit. And so, I ask you where, from the university perspective, I wanted to hear where you feel that who are the stakeholders, where do we start, and how do you feel we can best move things in a direction where we're having courses that are within majors and minors in the language, where we're having universities looking at calibrating their courses, and where we're also giving students the wherewithal, like the ability to see that they can do this in addition to or as a part of their majors and minors?
That's $1 million question, and it's a really astute question, especially if you look at the MLA language enrollment survey. There's been a precipitous drop in language enrollment nationwide, and especially at the 3,000 and 4,000 level, which are majors and minors. And so this is where, the numbers game, when I have faculty complaining to me that their upper level content course has been canceled, I said, well, there's no students to fill that course. And this is where I've said in different venues that, to my own faculty, that our students are not born freshmen. They have a prehistory. We need to bridge that gap between high school and higher ed, and it needs to be a priority for university faculty to talk with high school teachers, especially, who are advocates for us with their students, and not think that somehow higher ed is more important or what have you than high schools or middle schools or even grade schools. And here in Georgia, there's a lot of dual language immersion schools starting at very young ages. It's really important for us to be tapped into that, so we can draw those students. But we also need to be offering courses that are attractive to them. If we're offering our standard 19th century Spanish literature course, because I think you're pointing to something really interesting, which are, if you think of joint degrees of economics with a language, engineering with a language,
That's right.
global affairs with a language, and we're talking about language.
Or even, yeah.
We're talking about
I was just going to say, or
culture.
even my daughter is studying public health as a minor. That's one of her minors. Her second minor is Spanish. But to look at it, if we were to ask the question, what would happen if one of those upper level language courses was a public health course, or something that students could use towards a major or minor in a different area?
What would happen is students would enroll in those courses.
Right, and then it changes kind of the dynamic of universities looking for higher enrollments, right, Danko? Because then when we're looking to try and enroll students in those upper level courses, if those courses are something that allow students to move forward on their own pathways in their majors and minors, it also, and of course in language proficiency, then we're creating possibilities for universities as well, even from a financial standpoint.
Yeah, and it's there. This is where this distinction between commonly taught languages and less commonly taught languages is very pronounced, because you can run a content course in Spanish, possibly in French, but you are not, unless there is a pocket of heritage speakers who are currently students at your university, you cannot do it for Tagalog or Polish or whatever. So I think the key issue here, everybody today speaks about diversification, diversity and inclusion and whatnot. There's no better way to diversify and to include than to have different languages that are not languages of former colonial oppressors. And the commonly taught languages, for those who might not be familiar, French, Spanish, and German. The only thing missing is Portuguese. Otherwise, it would be kind of a perfect procession of colonial languages. So the problem with less commonly taught languages, even those less commonly taught languages, is your students are not going to come from a high school pipeline of language learning, so you have to target them somehow. One problem is that they might not be aware of the value that their language has because of this melting pot oppression for many years. The second problem is that they are dispersed geographically. So how to change this? One possibility for collaboration with different universities, community organizations, high schools, and so on and so forth, would be to create catalogs or directories of pockets of speakers of different languages, so that you have a list. You basically survey a high school and you ask, what languages does your family speak, or something like that. I'm going to be teaching at Columbia next semester, and I was looking into the statistics for speakers of other languages in the city of New York, it's over 50% have some other language if you include first and second generation. So these people are there. They have language abilities. The issue is you cannot just look into your backyard, because nowadays, especially with online teaching, your students will come from everywhere. So what we would really need is some kind of national register of high school speakers, of heritage speakers of different languages, or they don't even have to be heritage speaker. There are LDS missionaries who go there, and they kind of have some language proficiency and so on and so forth. People gain language proficiency in different ways. So I think reaching those people and then broadening offering of languages that are not a consequence of teaching, of which is not a consequence of dark colonial legacy, would be something to do.
I think that's a very important point, and I think the point you make about online learning and the way we can utilize technology and the potential for research and gathering data like that would allow for incredible collaboration at the university level to create opportunities that are in less commonly taught languages for students in all different places potentially as well. And I see that as a great idea for bridging some of those gaps that we know have unfortunately existed and continue to be a part of what we work away from, we try to work move away from. So I think that the idea of where we start and how we change this is very clear now. I guess that some of the questions I have in addition to that are, where in the university system can we look for some of these research pieces to take place? Is there space there for something like that, for a collaborative effort to move us towards something like a national registry? These things don't happen just by poof, right? We have to figure out who's going to do the research, where is the research going to come from? But it does beg the question also, how can we create a collaborative model that utilizes the best research and faculty members and research techniques of universities around the country to build towards this? And in gathering this data, what other information is important in order for us to have the best outcomes?
That's a very interesting question. The first thing that comes to my mind is there's a lot of conversations happening in the Association of Department of Foreign Languages, the ADFL, which is part of the Modern Language Association. And so I'll give a shout out to Dennis Looney, the director of the ADFL. So he's really kind of leading the charge on a lot of these conversations of kind of creating consortium between different language departments that would address some of the issues that Danko was just talking about, where you have a upper level class in, say, Chinese, and you can't draw the number of students that you need, and you could have, through online technology, you could create a kind of consortium. It brings up other obstacles such as bean counting and who gets the credit hours, because tuition dollars are tied to credit hours, and kind of in the age of austerity, every resource is a valuable resource. So it takes some kind of outside the box thinking to get beyond those obstacles and see that there's value beyond just the credit hours.
But there is a model for that, though, right, Bill? There's a basic model for that in study abroad, actually, through universities. And many years ago, in another lifetime, I worked for the study abroad program at NYU and was able to see where I could bring NYU programs to students around the country in different universities. And as I started to understand better the way that the consortia work for study abroad programs, it seems to me that presents a precedent for us to be able to do something like that, right?
Absolutely.
Actually, there are already programs like that in place. Big Ten has a program where they course sharing schema, and Ivy League schools as well. The kind of what makes it easier for them is that they're already a consortium of another kind, and you just plug it in. At Arizona State, this whole idea of kind of aligning proficiency outcomes with actual can-do statements was also meant to enable course sharing. So We offer Romanian, not very many people offer Romanian. Somebody else would offer Kiswahili. We don't have Kiswahili. We would trade that and have people enrolled, synchronous online teaching, and so on and so forth. We've started the process 2 years ago, but there are a lot of obstacles if you don't already have an existing structure. We thought, well, let's start easy. Let's start with University of Arizona, which is the same Board of Regents. Even that is complicated. We've been waiting for medical school to or School of Health Services to have an agreement in place, upon which we would then base our agreement. So there are a lot of bureaucratic hurdles to this,
right.
But the general idea is a very good one, and that makes sense. That makes sense financially also. If you cannot justify a course in a less commonly taught language with your students, you can justify it with additional students from other universities, and other universities can justify it with your students. So it's everybody's benefit. And I think in terms of targeting heritage speakers or speakers of other languages, crowdsourcing might work. So that there's a kind of crowdsourcing call to different departments of foreign languages just to plug in the data. We might not get all of them, but we may, and kind of another important issue is the census. We're going to get the census results very soon, and we would be able to target areas at least with high concentrations. And then you go, I had a grant from State Department to look into heritage speakers of Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, and I went to these venues, that was 10 years ago, to these venues where there are different venues like places of worship, restaurants, and so on and so forth, where simply by identifying those venues where people congregate, one can reach with university advertising, so not just in your area, but across the country.
That's a wonderful idea. I love the way we're talking about the community-based outreach that needs to happen in order for us to demonstrate the value of heritage language or indigenous language, or as well as home language. And when I say that, I also think about the incredible community-based heritage language schools and the great coalition that C.R.E.D Nichols works with over at American University to help bring that to the forefront. My own children actually attended a heritage language school, a Chinese community school here in Westfield, New Jersey, as my husband is part Chinese as well. So this is part of their heritage. But it was that disconnect, exactly what you're talking about, Danko, that I think that they are always missing out on understanding how this process can grow into a situation where the things that are growing in their students linguistically and culturally by being a part of these programs across the K through 12 years really would be a great asset if we knew that the universities were looking to these community schools as a place to find students in whatever language is being spoken, in whatever of the less commonly taught languages or heritage languages that are being taught around the country in these types of schools were to be enhanced by outreach from universities. And I think about this also from the perspective of C.R.E.D Nichols and our legislative work and our advocacy work on Capitol Hill, and the title programming like Title VI and the different types of possibilities for research and the things that go into National Security Education Program. I was honored to be a Boren Scholar in the first year of the program in 1994, and I know it changed my life. And when I think about how are we really framing these opportunities from an earlier age and in our advocacy and legislative growth to make sure that this is part of the conversation? How are we connecting language to everything else in education and in the workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea is to show how language infiltrates really everything. Some years ago, like 3 or 4 years ago, the Career Services Office called me because they were developing these kind of career pathways. If you're going to major in this, then a possible career may be X, Y, or Z, right? So if you're going to study economics, you could, work for the World Bank or something like that, right? And they asked me, well, what we can see with certain majors what the pathway is. It's pretty clear, but what is it for languages? and they had kind of specified like 15 different pathways. I said, well, it should be in all of them. And they said, no, you can only choose one. I was like, well, it says who? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So I called some friends over at the Georgia Department of Education and had them I sicked them on the career services people and said, tell them what's what. So, because again, there's a lot of kind of misconceptions of, about language proficiency, about, people kind of thinking of their own experience in high school. I studied it for 4 years and I don't know anything. So we're fighting against a lot of myths that people kind of still hold on to. And one is just, what are you going to do with that? And so students will say to me, what am I going to do with a language if I'm not going to live or work abroad? And so, I have a 3-day answer to that. But one thing that you mentioned, Title VI. So we have a Title VI center here at Georgia State, and we organize this World Languages Day, where we bring about just over 1,000 students to campus, and we have employers, every big and small. Social Security Administration has been, American Red Cross, and Mercedes-Benz is a sponsor of the event. Delta has come, and so they talk directly to students to show them what opportunities open when they continue their language study and really develop cultural competence.
Well, it seems to me that a model like that is exactly where we can start by doing things like what Georgia State does across different universities around the country. And I think that that's a very important way to get students to see themselves in their futures, and see where they fit in. I know, Danko, what you were saying before about recognizing students' languages, their home languages, their heritage languages, and, the less commonly taught languages that are so much a part of communities across our country, that we want to make sure that we can help our students see themselves in those visions of the future. One thing I would add to that conversation is for us to remember who our upcoming students are right now. And I say this also as a parent of 2 teenagers, one who's already in college, one who's getting ready to go. And when I think about that, and I think about the concepts of the way that they're active in the world and the type of ways that they look at the world, the concept of the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals and how they play a part in the way that our students actually potentially can think and will move down the pathway to the future through climate change and other pieces like that. And in my opinion, this is an opportunity, again, to show students, and I'm thinking about this, that you have 15 different ways to go with languages when we know it's many millions more, because there are so many possibilities and they're limitless if the languages are embedded in other parts of the learning. And so I think that that's a part of the conversation that we can also have, especially when it comes to things like STEM, where we know that the conversation around funding, and we know that the conversation about what our country needs and what we need, in business and in nonprofit is such a focus on health and on pieces like climate and energy, that we can make sure that we can start to have those conversations and help students see where language is a part of that and can be a part of their studies. So, Danko, I wonder when you think about where we can go with something like that at your university, for example, how do you get that information to students about where they can see themselves in the future?
Well, actually, that's something I would just like to go to the comments, because there is something that is along that lines. A comment that in the UK they combine majors, so that's kind of adding these soft skills, what is known in the corporate world, to whatever they have as their main skills. I think we're all fighting for our majors. I think it would be good to attach a higher value to our minors, because socially that's really where we are basically helping our students to get that. I remember I have a student who was applying for med school. She did an honors thesis with me on Polish medical terminology, linguistic honors thesis, and she claimed that afterwards that helped her, because they wanted, everybody has those chemistry, biology and whatnot background, but if somebody has humanities background, they would they're likely to have better bedside manners and so on and so forth. So these skills might be shown as valuable, and that's what we are trying to do with our students to add those. There's another very interesting comment in the comments that about recruiting, that university language department should be similar to athletic departments, because the athletic department send scouts now.
Absolutely.
The thing is, especially with the advent of online teaching and massive online operations like we have at Arizona State University, it's not enough to scout in your neck of the woods. You need to scout nationwide, and that should be targeted, I think, partially based on census data. If you have languages that you teach, less commonly taught languages, look where those speakers are, look where those heritage centers are, and so on and so forth. So I think that's, again, another source is, and it's also mentioned in the comments, and I would like to direct your attention there, books about community-based language learning. And community-based language learning is, I think, an untapped potential for us.
Completely agree with you.
Because they don't come with some tests. We would want to, when we do, we also do language fair every year, but we invite exclusively high schools. You don't get people coming from heritage language learning centers and so on and so forth, because their numbers would be relatively small. So, yeah.
This is such a fabulous conversation. I think it's such a great start for us as we talk about these ideas, and it really will make a profound difference in the way our students move forward and look at their college possibilities if they can see themselves in the college process. And I want to say that very clearly, because I think this is about identity. I think this is about cultural representations and opportunities. And as we know, it is so clear that our college admissions process needs to be overhauled in general, that especially for purposes of equity, that this is one of the keys to doing that. And I agree with you, Danko, that that the heritage communities are an untapped resource for getting us to that space, for helping students and families realize those possibilities. And one other thing, just with regard to the scouting, one of my favorite things that we discovered in my daughter's college search process was that there was one university that was actually scouting for writers, for students who were good writers. And it was like a quiet thing on campus. And if you found the people who were doing this, then you could send them examples of your work, and they would write a letter to the admissions office to help, boost your application. And I wish that was more of the rule than the exception. I certainly think that our values with regard to how we recruit students need to adjust as well. So for the last part of this conversation, I just really want us to think about and start, and of course, if people are listening, certainly share comments and ideas. How can we create the collaborative partnerships we need to focus on these issues? I think today, the three of us have started this conversation and made a commitment. I feel it's about conversation, commitment, and collaboration for the future. And so the way that we can do this, what are some of the next steps that we can take? And I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
One thing that occurs to me as we're talking about collaborative partnerships, because you said something that really resonated with me, which is kind of helping students see themselves in the future, something to that effect. And so one thing that we've started doing in our department is inviting alumni to come back and talk about their pathway and their trajectory after graduation. One of the kind of issues is a lot of language departments at the university level still offer curriculum and are still structured as if the majority of our students are going to PhD programs or graduate programs, and that's just simply not the case. And we've had students go into all kinds of different career fields, and so we bring them back to talk with students and talk with high school students when they come to visit campus. So these students can see almost as a mirror reflection themselves as, well, God, in 6 or 7 years, that could be me, right? So I think when we're talking about collaborative partnerships, alumni, and think about how to integrate the alumni voice, because like I said, I'm a department chair of a language department. A student sees me walking down the hall, they know I'm going to be promoting languages. But an alumni comes back, they're not expecting that. It carries a lot more weight to hear their voice.
Absolutely. And, alumni are worth more than money to universities, right? And
Oh
potentially
yeah.
worth much more to our students and our children. And as I think about this global C.R.E.D conference and the types of voices we've been able to hear about how language has altered their experiences in life, their experiences in their careers. I know my own, for example, my daughter's, and even her mentor, who was here earlier today talking about how his experience as a refugee and as a language speaker changed his opportunities. And I feel like getting people with those voices in front of our students as soon as possible, maybe even before university experiences, would make a difference. But I also have to say that I think that those voices need to be heard again by our college admissions officers, by our college advisors, by our high school guidance counselors, because I think in order to educate across the process, it needs to go beyond the students and the families. It needs to also, we have to make a complete circle with education on this. Danko?
Yes, another venue that might be conducive to collaborative partnerships are national organizations. I've been involved with Nickel Tickle for many years, and recently also with NFMLTA. NFMLTA, if you look them up, nfmlta.org, we have these grants for learning and teaching priorities where one could organize a panel or a webinar and then look for collaborative partnerships there. We have these competitions for webinars or conference panels are twice a year. So if you go to NFMLTA, I don't see how I can put something in the comment. I see private chats, but I would have put the webpage. But anyway, nfmlta.org. So that might be a good start to organize a panel or a webinar and then look for possible partners within those organizations.
Certainly, and I can already share that JNCL Nichols is happy to partner on this. This is something very important to our process as we advocate for a legislation that supports language education in all of its ways that it comes across, whether it's K through 12, K through 16, as well as adults, as well as in business and not-for-profit sectors. So I think that our national organizations, even our regional and state organizations, have an important role to play in this. But again, we have to be careful not to preach to the choir, right? We have to make sure that we're broadening beyond our language organizations and making sure that if we're having our organizations lead these ideas, that we're inviting some of the other professional education organizations to the table to have these conversations. I would first invite the Association of College Admissions Officers to make sure that they're at the table in this conversation as well. And I'm sure that the two of you know a lot about faculty type organizations that might be great for this as well. And certainly beyond education and looking at ways we can bring chambers of commerce and people who are involved in different aspects of careers and the world to help us bring this together. And I certainly don't want to forget parents and students and making sure that that's a part of this conversation. So I know that we're going to finish up here in just a few moments. Before we finish, do either of you have anything you'd like to share to kind of sum up where we are?
I think we're actually in a good place to really forge some of these collaborations. Not only really is the communication technology there to facilitate kind of collaborative endeavors, but there's, I think a kind of burgeoning will to really look and shift the paradigm of higher ed, especially as it relates to K-12, and really think of this K through 16 or K through 20 pipeline. And so I really appreciate your comment about, there needs to be kind of cross-pollination, or the message needs to get across networks so that advisors and administrators, provosts and presidents are also hearing this. So I think that's a really good message. The other thing I would say to parents and students is be your own best advocate. Don't let an advisor steer you away from languages because it's faster for you to graduate. Stick to your guns, study abroad, study a language. It's your degree. You do what you want.
Thank you so much, Bill. Danko, did you want to say anything?
Yes, adding to all this and agreeing with everything that was said, I would say that we are living in exciting times where there is a commitment to diversification, and there is no better way to diversify than to add more languages into our system. Every language is a world in its own, with a different culture, different attitudes, different political, religious, whatever schemes. So I see the times that we live in as a great opportunity.
Thank you so much. And just to kind of sum up, this has been just a wonderful opportunity. And I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation because it's been something that's been on my mind for a couple of years now as I went through this process with my daughter. I agree with, and I echo what both of you said about this being an interesting time. We're at a time where educational technology had to kind of break down that fourth wall of every class, or break down all of the walls.
Yeah.
And we had to move forward quickly, find opportunities, find ways to connect in new ways. And now that we've got some of these tools, we have to figure out how to supercharge them, how to give them the energy they need to shift that paradigm and help us reconnect to the world after the pandemic as well, which I think is after the pandemic and after the different types of political shifts that we've seen. I think that's such an important aspect of what we can do as global educators and as those who recognize the value of global perspective for our students and of language proficiency for all of our children. And I too hope that this is the beginning of many, many more conversations and potentially a great set of collaborative efforts to bring stakeholders together from all different walks of life here and to build pathways for language learners to be recognized for their proficiency and to recognize themselves in the possibilities for their futures. I invite all of you to join me at the JNCL Nicholas Language Advocacy Days as well, where we can talk about this some more and talk about how we can advocate with our legislators to do the same. Thank you to Bill Nichols and to Danko Sipka. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the Global Seal and to Global C.R.E.D and Linda Ignatz for bringing this together. Wish everyone a healthy and safe rest of the year.